Hi, everyone. We're going to give just another minute or two so that we can get everyone um, time to log in and get admitted from the waiting room. But while you're waiting, feel free to share with us who you are, where you're from, and if you're a parent or a teacher or what brought you here. We have someone from Japan. Welcome.
And if they're in Japan now, my son lives in Japan, and so I know it is the middle of the night in Japan right now. So more power to them if they're tuning in from Japan.
Excited to see. I saw we have an ed psych with us. Teachers,
Yeah,
parents.
real variety. It's nice. System principals.
I love it.
Yeah.
Level 4 coordinators, Canada, welcome. All right, I'm going to get us started, and I'm sure that we'll still have some more that join us. I have my camera off this morning because it's being a little froggy on me, I guess. So I'm Dr. Amy Thompson. I am the program coordinator here at the University of Central Arkansas in the MSc in Literacy and Dyslexia program. We are the only program that is accredited by the International Dyslexia Association in Arkansas and one of a limited list throughout the United States. We are very excited to have you with us today. This is sponsored by our UCA Foundation grant. And so that is exciting. We have a list here for you of all of our programs that are available online. If you're interested in any of those, I'll put my email address in the chat box. Feel free to reach out. All of our programs are fully online, asynchronous, and we have a great tuition. We're very competitive. $325 a credit hour. That's a flat rate, so no fees on top of that. So if you are also interested in the reading specialist, we also do the Teach grant. So lots of opportunities there for you. All right, so I am so excited today to introduce you and welcome Dr. Peg Dawson with us. She's the co-author of the book Smart But Scattered and Smart But Scattered Teens. In over 40 years of clinical practice, Dr. Dawson has worked with thousands of children and teens who struggle at home and in school. At the center of their struggles are often weak executive skills. Along with her colleague, Dr. Richard Guare, I know I'm going to butcher that.
It's Guare. No one ever gets it right.
Thank you. She's written numerous books on this topic for educators, mental health professionals, and parents, including Smart But Scattered Teens, Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents, and Coaching Students with Executive Skills Deficits. She's also past president of the National Association of School Psychologists and the International School Psychology Association, and a recipient of the NASP's Lifetime Achievement Award. We are very excited to have you with us at UCA, and I will turn the floor over.
Okay, and I'm delighted to be here. Just a little more about my background. My original area of expertise, I started out as a school psychologist. I worked in the public schools for about 16 years, and then joined my colleague and my co-author in a private practice where we were focused particularly on kids with attention disorders. my original area of interest was learning disabilities. I did my dissertation in that area. So I have that background, as well as then I moved into working more extensively with kids with ADHD. And that's what actually led me to executive skills was as I began to work with those kids more extensively in my clinical practice. I pretty quickly realized that the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is problems with attention or problems with hyperactivity, impulsivity, or both, really didn't begin to describe the problems I saw these kids having. I saw huge problems with time management, organization, and planning. And I remember talking with my colleague Dick about it at the time. He and I both did our doctoral work at the University of Virginia, although we were there at different times. But he went on to do a postdoc in neuropsychology at Children's Hospital in Boston. So as I was describing those issues to him, he said, well, Peg, those are executive skills. Well, this was the late 80s, early 90s, and people were not using that term much in those days. So he and I decided we really wanted to understand these skills better. What are they? How do they develop? What's going on in the brain? How do they impact school performance? And most importantly, how do you help kids with weak executive skills become more successful students? And so that's what led to our writing. We wrote a book for professionals first called Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents. It's now in its third edition. But after writing that, we realized there was a huge role for parents in all of this. So that's what led us to write Smart But Scattered Teens. There are a couple more books in that series. We've written a book for adults called The Smart But Scattered Guide to Success, because we realized that the same strategies that work with kids can be tweaked to work with adults. And there are a lot of adults out there who struggle with various aspects of executive functioning. So that's sort of my background. Actually, one more piece about me, because it might come up over the course of our time together, is at the same time I was doing all of this professionally, I was raising two kids of my own. I have two sons who are now well into adulthood. I'm a grandmother at this point. But my older son at the age of 14 was diagnosed with an attention disorder. And so I actually feel like a lot of what I've learned about executive skills, particularly on the intervention side, has come as much from my experience as a mom as my experience as a psychologist. And the nice thing about being the mom of one of these kids is you get the longitudinal perspective. You get to see what these kids look like when they grow up. And I do a lot of parent presentations. I'm sure many of you in the audience are parents, and some of you may be parents of kids struggling with executive skills. My message to parents all the time is most of these kids turn out fine. And I can almost see the audience relax at that point if I'm doing a live presentation, because if you're in the early stages of dealing with one of these kids, it may look pretty daunting to you. Because you don't know what the future will bring. But you know what? Kids grow up, they mature, their brains mature. And if you use the kinds of strategies that are described in great detail in our book, and which I'll allude to some extent over the course of my presentation today, these kids really do have a good shot at success, which is why I enjoy working with them. So I did, some of you may have gone to it. I did a presentation for Patent, I forget what that stands for, in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, and they wanted me to address executive skills and literacy. And so that really sort of made me stop and think about how do executive skills map onto the various aspects of literacy. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. But I'm going to start by just giving you an introduction to executive skills, which will be familiar to you if you've read the book. But it's always good to get a refresher. And then I'll go through it skill by skill and just give you a little more information about each skill, particularly focusing on what are some of the things we do about it? How do we address kids who struggle with those? So that's basically where I would go. Let me now share my screen. And so I always start my any presentation with, so there are three key concepts about executive skills that I think are really important for people to understand. And so actually, sometimes I do workshops for teachers after school, and I know they've been in the classroom all day, and I'm pretty sure they're exhausted, and I'm always afraid they're going to fall asleep before the end of my workshops. So that's where I start those workshops as well. I'm going to tell you three key things about executive skills. I tell those teachers, and I'm going to tell them to you up front. So if you fall asleep after this, you'll at least have those three pieces of information. Luckily, I know it's morning for you. This is not everybody's low time, but since sleep consolidates memory, actually, if you do fall asleep and you hear these three things, you may hold on to them. So let me go through those. So first of all, what executive skills are? They are brain-based skills. They are managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, which is the part of the brain right behind the forehead. And they take a minimum of 25 years to reach full maturation. And that's in typically developing students. If you have kids with attention disorders or any kind of neurodevelopmental learning disorder, it may take longer. It usually does take longer. We call them executive skills because they're the skills required to execute tasks. I think that's one way to understand why we call them that. Although I teach a class at the University of Southern Maine every summer, and we meet for a full week and talk about executive skills. And I had a second grade teacher in that class a few years ago who was trying to figure out how can I explain executive skills to second graders. And what she came up with is they are the skills you need to get things done, which I think captures it as just as well as any more technical terms we could use. They're the skills you need to get things done. So that's point number one. Point number two is, until these skills are fully mature, it's our job as parents, teachers, and adults who work with kids to act as surrogate frontal lobes for those kids. We basically lend them our frontal lobes. And in my experience, we do this pretty naturally when kids are young, and then somewhere around middle school, things go horribly wrong. And I'll give you a quick piece of evidence for why that is in just a minute, but to show you that these skills become problematic around middle school. But I think the important thing is to understand that there's, by the time kids hit middle school, our expectations, and I'm talking about both parents and teachers, our expectations for brain development is way up here. Actual brain development is down there. So there's this gap between what we're asking kids to do at the middle school level and what their brains are comfortable doing. And that causes all kinds of problems. There is a third point, though, because we can't act as surrogate frontal lobes for kids forever, because then we'd have to follow them around for the rest of their lives. So the third point is this: it's also our job as parents, teachers, and adults who work with kids to ensure that they grow their own executive skills. And if that's not happening naturally, then we need to figure out ways to explicitly teach these skills and to give kids lots and lots of opportunity to practice them. So just to go a little further in terms of introducing the field, let me start by saying there's not a lot of consensus in the field if you look at what the research says about executive skills. This is not unusual. This is true of any big educational or psychological construct. I mean, think about the reading wars that have been going on ever since I entered my profession, 40 years ago. There's still arguments about the best way to teach reading and what's going on underneath that contributes to reading acquisition or impedes reading acquisition. So same is true with executive skills. With executive skills, though, it actually starts with a title in terms of the lack of consensus. The most common term is executive functions. And if you want to know what the research says, you should probably type executive functions into an academic search engine, because that's the term the researchers use. But my colleague Dick and I chose to call them executive skills for a very particular reason, and that was we wanted the emphasis to be on skills. A skill implies whatever level you're at, you can get better at it. Function doesn't give me that same flavor. I mean, when I think of function, I think, okay, it means use, and then I start thinking about refrigerators or copy machines. They either work or they don't work. Some people combine the two and call them executive function skills. I'm happy with that because that keeps skills in the title. There's also not a lot of consensus about how many skills we're talking about. The range I've seen is 1 to 33. One of the earlier researchers on executive skills decided there's really only one executive skill, we call it the central executive. At the opposite end of the extreme, a guy named George McCluskey has created a rating scale where he's assessing 33 different executive skills. So obviously, if you have that big a range, then there's also no consensus about what the specific skills are. So again, when Dick and I first started thinking about this, we started with this question of all the skills there are out there that people are talking about. Which ones are most critical for school success? Because that was our background, and that was our professional interest, was working with kids in schools. And we also wanted to define a pool of those skills that didn't go overboard, because a part of our message is if kids aren't acquiring them naturally, it's our job to teach them. Trying to teach 33 skills sounds too daunting for any parent or teacher that I know. So we settled on 11. And so we're going to spend the rest of the morning talking about those 11 skills first generally, and then as they apply to acquisition of reading and reading comprehension. So here are the 11 skills that we focus on. And recently, and this is not in any of our books, I certainly know it's not in Smart but Scattered, we've divided them into, I've started dividing them into two groups: foundational skills and advanced skills. And the more I talk about them in those two sort of clusters, the more feedback I get from both parents and teachers that this is really helpful. So the foundational skills are the skills that develop first. And the order in which I've listed them there is the order in which we think they emerge developmentally, starting from shortly after birth. That order is somewhat speculative. No one's tried to create a timeline of which skill comes first, second. Some of these are emerging almost simultaneously. But especially with the first three, I'm really pulling off of Russ Barkley's research in his writings, because he does talk about at what age in infancy some of these skills begin to develop. So those are the foundational skills, again, in the order in which we think they emerge. With the advanced skills, that order is more arbitrary, except for metacognition. We think that metacognition is the last executive skill to emerge, at least in any kind of sophisticated form. We do talk about metacognition in preschoolers. I think it looks very different in older kids because once the brain acquires a more sophisticated form of metacognition, the brain changes dramatically. So of all those skills that you can see listed on that slide, most of them are almost self-defined. I mean, you can look at each label there and understand what we're talking about for the most part. The one that tends to trip people up is metacognition. And so, the throwaway definition for metacognition is it's thinking about thinking, which I'm not even sure what that means. So here's how I think about metacognition, again, because I'm trying to capture the developmental context. I think of metacognition as the awareness that you have thoughts and that you can use those thoughts to understand the world, solve problems, make sense out of things. Now, kids have thoughts from a very early age. As soon as they acquire language, they're talking their thoughts out loud. And eventually the thoughts go inside. We call it internalized speech. And pretty soon they disappear altogether. So as someone observing a child, we can't tell what their thoughts are. But that's not the same thing as being aware that you can use your thoughts as tools. That's a different way of thinking about thinking, actually, or thinking or using your thoughts. Because once you have that awareness, then you'll see a bump in those other advanced skills, because now you can use your thoughts to plan or prioritize, to create organizational systems, to figure out how to manage time and to set goals. So that's roughly the order in which, that is the order in which I'll talk about them today. Before I start talking about them, though, I want to make one other point. And that is, when I am talking with parents or teachers of elementary age kids, my advice to them is focus on the foundational skills, because those are the first skills to develop. And if you put interventions in place during the elementary school years and keep them in place long enough, you will see progress. Even with kids who struggle with them, you will see progress across elementary school. It doesn't mean you ignore the advanced skills. You certainly talk about them, you model them, you explain to kids why organization is important, or let's make a plan. So you build it into your language with kids, but we do not expect kids to be good at those advanced skills, by the time they finish elementary school. And actually, even when I'm talking with parents or teachers of middle school kids, what I tell them is, if you expect kids at that age to be proficient in those advanced skills, you must be very frustrated, because for most kids, most of these skills are just emerging at the middle school level. And what we know about emerging skills is they look great one day and lousy the next. No, it's not a simple, smooth process of learning the skill. Think about learning to ride a bike. You don't go from not being able to ride a bike at all to being able to ride 3 miles fluidly without falling off. No, there's a lot of falling down that goes in between those 2 points. And some practice sessions go better than others. So that's what's happening with the advanced skills during the middle school years and even into the first couple of years of high school. Kids are still feeling their way with many of these advanced skills. And again, I'm talking about typically developing kids because there's a time lag for older kids. I mean, for kids with learning or attention problems. Now, the other piece of advice I give is if you work with middle school or high school kids that have significant executive skill challenges, my advice is start with the foundational skills because they are the building blocks for the later advanced skills. So as you're working on those foundational skills, you will see improvements in the advanced skills as well because you're contributing to that. And when I've done surveys, and I haven't done formal surveys, but whenever I do informal surveys of middle school, high school kids to find out what they say is their weaker skills, it's always the foundational skills that come up. And when I ask middle high school special ed teachers to give me the top 3 executive skills that their kids are struggling with, they always end up being in those foundational skills. So I think I feel like I'm pretty secure in feeling like those are separate skills and this is the place to start. Now, let me just share one more thing before we start going through them skill by skill. So this is, I want to show you how the brain develops. And I'm going to use a series of MRI scans that were taken by a neuroscientist named Paul Thompson at UCLA. I did this quite a few years ago because I downloaded this off the New York Times website in 2008. It's no longer, unfortunately, on the website. But what he did was he brought kids in once a year, starting at age 4, and he went till they were 21, and he took an MRI scan of their brain, a snapshot of their brain using an MRI machine. And then he created a composite. And so I'm going to show you how late in the process the frontal lobes develop. So frontal lobes is where executive skills are. So the key to understanding these slides is the color. So an immature brain is red and orange. A mature brain is blue and purple. So you can see, and look at the right-hand image, because that's where it's the clearest. The top part of that right-hand image, that's the frontal lobe. So just by looking at that, what you can tell by that is the frontal lobes are the most immature part of the brain. They're the last part of the brain to develop in utero, and they're the last part of the brain to develop across childhood. And we see the evidence for that already at age 4, because more of the frontal lobes are red and orange than any other part of the brain. The part that's blue, there's nothing that's purple because nothing's mature by age 4. The part that's blue is mostly around sensory input, like vision and touch. So I'm going to take you pretty quickly to age 21, and I want you to see how late in the process the frontal lobes turn blue. They don't turn purple because the brain isn't mature at that point. I wish he'd gone to age 25, but he didn't. The other thing to understand that you'll be able to see is that the brain matures from back to front, because the back of the brain is the most primitive part of the brain. Frontal lobes are the most advanced part of the brain. And so what you'll see, again, with that right-hand image, the bottom of that image, that's the back of the brain. The top of the image, that's the front of the brain. You'll see the blue start at the bottom of this image and then travel up. Okay, so let me show this to you. Okay, so there we are at age 21. I see a fair amount of purple, but I don't see much in the frontal lobes. It's really hard to even make that out. And there's still a fair amount of green in the frontal lobes. And in fact, the text there says the 21-year-old brain is mostly mature, but the areas of green show that even at the threshold of legal adulthood, there is still room for increases in emotional maturity and decision-making skills, which will come in the next few years. So let me bring you back to age 13, because that's middle school. And that's, I want to reinforce that point, is that many of these skills are just emerging at the middle school age. So let me bring you back. Whoops, what happened there? Why did it not stop? Let me see if it'll do it this time. Oh, for some reason, I can't get it to stop. All right, let me see if I can do it this way. Nope, I can't. I don't know why this is acting up on me. So maybe I can just hold it. I'll just hold it. Okay, yeah, I can hold it. So there's age 13. Look at the frontal lobes. They're mostly green. There's a lot less red and orange, although there is some. And actually, when I look at the blue at age 13, I'm not seeing a whole lot more blue than I saw at age 4. In fact, let me go back to age 4. There's age 4. All right, now let me stop. There's 13. So think about what we ask 13-year-olds to keep track of, remember, plan, organize. As soon as they start changing classes, every teacher has a different set of expectations about how homework is to be done, how notebooks are to be kept, how tests are to be taken, how projects are to be completed. Many schools use block scheduling at that point, and kids have A days and B days to keep track of. Many schools use rotating schedules. So first period on Monday is second period on Tuesday, et cetera. I've worked in several schools in the past few years that had 7-day rotating schedules. So first period on Monday changed from week to week. These kids often have complicated after school schedules, and many are living in 2 homes. And we get upset because they forget something. We are putting a tremendous amount of pressure on that 13-year-old brain and those still developing executive skills. So I'm always preaching patience to parents and teachers of kids at that age, and talking to them about how can we support these kids with their weak executive skills, and how can we support the development of those skills in a developmentally appropriate fashion. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through skill by skill. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, again, if you've read Smart but Scattered, that none of this will be new to you, but so I will try to highlight what we focus on for just some additional information, just to highlight, here's both what's important to understand about each skill, and here's where we think about what an intervention would look like. It's obviously not going into detail, but it'll give you a snapshot anyway. All right, so let me go to the next. Yeah. So we're going to start with response inhibition, which is the ability to stop and think before you say or do something. Russ Barkley maintains this, again, I consider him the world's leading expert on ADHD. And he's also one of the first researchers to make that connection between attention disorders and executive skills. Barkley maintains this is the most critical skill. If you don't get response inhibition, how are you ever going to get something like planning or time management? It emerges around 6 months of age in an infant. It's pretty rudimentary at that point. You know, what a 6-month-old has available to it is respond, don't respond. It's going to look different in a 13-year-old, different in a 3-year-old. As kids acquire language as well, they use language to support response inhibition. So if you hear a toddler saying to herself, no, don't do that, because she's heard a parent say that to her, she's using language to inhibit a response. So the strategy we use to teach response inhibition, and it's most relevant for young children, but I think it bears repeating at any age, is we teach wait and stop. If you can get wait and stop into kids, that's basically response inhibition. And there's some very natural ways that parents of young children do this. I collect these stories, but I'll just give you one quick example. A few years ago, I was flying out to Arizona to do a series of seminars. And I went through security in Boston, and I picked up some coffee from Starbucks, and Starbucks was right next to a food court. And there was a mom and a little girl who looked to be about 3 to me. They just bought some food in the food court, and I was eavesdropping on their conversation. And the little girl wanted to eat the food right then. And I heard the mom saying to her daughter, no, we're going to wait till we get to the gate first, and then you can eat your special treat. And the little girl was pushing back because she wanted to eat it right then. The mom just repeated very calmly, no, we're going to get to the gate first, and then you can eat your treat. So I kept an eye on them because I wanted to know who was going to win. The mom won. They waited till they got to the gate. So what was she doing? She was teaching her daughter to wait. It took 2 minutes. But if you do that, day in and day out across the early years of childhood, kids will learn that skill of stopping and waiting. And if you think about it, there are childhood games that have been around for generations, if not centuries, that do the same thing. Think about Simon Says, or think about Red Light, Green Light. Or we had a game when I was growing up called Mother May I. All those games require the children playing them to listen to the instructions, process what the instructions are, and then make a decision. Are they going to act? Are they going to stop? Are they going to wait? So all of that is response inhibition. And there's some fairly compelling longitudinal research to show that kids who acquire response inhibition at an early age tend to have better life outcomes than kids who don't. I won't go into detail on this, although I often do because it's a good story, but the research that people are most familiar with is the marshmallow test. And if you're familiar with that, you know that this was a study done by a social psychologist at Stanford University way back in the late 60s, early 70s, the original study, where he was trying to figure out when do kids acquire what he called delayed gratification, which is another word for response inhibition. So he brought kids into this empty lab room and he had a plate with a marshmallow on. He said, here's a marshmallow. You can eat it. You can eat it now if you want. But you know what? I have to leave the room for a few minutes. If you're able to wait until I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. So he leaves the 1 marshmallow behind, exits the room, goes behind a one-way mirror and watches to see what happens. And of course, some of those kids pop that marshmallow into their mouths as soon as his back would turn. Some kids were able to wait though. And in fact, he stayed away 15 minutes. The average amount of time kids were able to wait was 7 minutes, but about 30% of those kids were able to wait the full 15 minutes. So you can see that means response inhibition is developing around age 4. He followed those same kids up into high school and then into their late 40s, early 50s, and found differences at each of those points in time between the kids who popped that marshmallow in their mouths as soon as their back was turned and kids who were able to wait the full 15 minutes. The final outcome was the kids who could wait at, in their late 40s, early 50s were more tended to have higher educational attainment and were more likely to be engaged in professional careers. So I won't go into any more detail in this, but you may want to check this out because in 2013, Sesame Street hired Walter Mischel to teach delayed gratification to 4-year-olds because he maintained you could look at the kids who could wait the full 15 minutes. What strategies were they using? Because you can use those strategies. So if you go to YouTube, type in Sesame Street executive functions, you will get to all the skits and vignettes that Mischel and Sesame Street created to teach delayed gratification to 4-year-olds. And you may be able to think about ways to incorporate those little videos into your teaching because it's a great way to teach response inhibition. If you think about it, well, think about it for a minute. Which Sesame Street character would you use to teach delayed gratification? And if you thought about Cookie Monster, that would be the right answer. So go watch those videos and see if you can figure out how you could use them in your work with kids. Because I know a lot of teachers have done that and have been very happy with how kids learn to, as Cookie Monster would say, but me wait. So how they learn to wait. So working memory is the next executive skill to develop. The first part of it's fairly complicated skill, but the first part is the ability to hold information in mind while you're performing a complex task. So if I want to stress this out in a testing situation, the easiest way to do that is to ask kids a multi-step math problem, give kids a multi-step math problem, give it to them orally, ask them to solve it in their head. So question off a standard IQ test, 8 birds are on the ground, 4 birds fly away, 2 other birds land. How many birds are on the ground now? If I ask a kid that question and they do the first step and give me that as their answer, I'm immediately thinking, what's going on in working memory? Have they forgotten what the question is asking? Have they forgotten what step they're on? That question also requires the child to hold on to those precise numbers and to pull from long-term memory into working memory 2 math procedures, addition and subtraction. So there's a lot of working memory load in that one question. But there is nothing we ask kids to do that doesn't require working memory. Even giving kids a 1-step instruction, you have to remember what the instruction was. And over the years, I've done work in a number of schools for kids with dyslexia or kids with complex learning disabilities. And what those teachers tell me is that working memory is the weakest skill for those kids. They have trouble holding on to critical information. In fact, it's what underlies, it's what contributes to kids with dyslexia, the difficulty, not just learning sight words, but remembering and being able to quickly apply phonics rules or, other rules for pronunciation, spelling, math facts, all of that working memory is involved. And it's a challenge, it's a weak skill. And there's a lot of research to show that this tends to be the weakest skill for kids with learning disabilities. And so my immediate conclusion from that is these are kids who are going to need cues, prompts, and reminders for far longer than we think we should have to give them, because they have trouble holding that information in their head and retrieving it when they need to. And so keep that in mind in terms of, and whenever possible, the cue, prompt, or reminder should have a visual to it, because it's in one ear, out the other with kids with weak working memory, or anybody with weak working memory for that matter. So if we give them visual cues to support them, then that can prop up some of the challenges posed by weak working memory. All right, let's go on to emotional control, which is the ability to manage emotions in order to accomplish things. This may be the most complicated executive skill. I mean, the brain is hardwired for emotional control and all executive skills to develop. But with emotional control, it's actually a complex dance between the internal hardwiring of the brain and the environment which the infant finds itself. So an infant who's in the best position to develop good emotional control is one who by 7 months of age at the latest has a consistent, reliable caregiver who responds to his or her physical and emotional needs in an appropriate and timely fashion. And there's one additional ingredient: that caregiver is able to manage their own emotions well, because there's a mirroring process that goes on in terms of learning emotional control. In fact, we call them mirror neurons. Infants learn to manage their emotions by watching how those around them manage theirs. Now, emotional control, we sometimes don't connect that. I mean, we think of learning as being cognitive, academic, and emotions over here. Emotional control is absolutely critical to learning, both on the plus side and on the minus side. I mean, if you're flooded with negative emotions, that can work as fast as anything to shut down other executive skills, because you're going to have trouble paying attention. You're going to have trouble understanding what the lesson is. You're going to have trouble remembering the content of the lesson afterwards because of being flooded with emotions. On the other hand, if whatever you're learning uses and can bring out from kids positive emotions, then that makes it easier to pay attention, to understand the lesson, and to remember it. So teachers who figure out ways to make learning fun, ways to engage kids' positive emotions in learning, those kids tend to be better off. Now, I also think about emotional control when I think about kids with learning disabilities or dyslexia. And it took me a while to make that connection, because I thought of dyslexia as a cognitive processing disorder. I mean, we know from the Shawitz's research at Yale, they were the original researchers, that there are key pieces in the left hemisphere of the brain of kids with dyslexia that don't work right. There's a word retrieval piece, and there's a phonological processing piece. And so that helps explain why kids are struggling to learn to read. But in my experience, kids with dyslexia almost have to have better emotional control than typically developing kids. Why? Because no matter how well taught they are, they're going to experience more failure going through school than typical kids do. And they have to have some way of managing the emotions associated with that failure. The shame, the embarrassment, the anger, the irritation, the frustration, all of those things. And so strategies we use with kids who struggle with emotional control, we teach them to talk to themselves. What could you say to yourself to manage that anger, that irritation? And there's some good brain research to show why that works, because If you put people in emotionally charged situations and teach them to talk to themselves, what you see is decreased activity in the amygdala, which is the fight or flight part of the brain, and increased activity in the frontal lobes. So self-talk becomes the pathway to emotional control. And then mindfulness meditation techniques are also very effective. And there are some really nice school-based curricula out there designed to teach mindfulness. I think the best known one is Goldie Hawn's Mind Up curriculum, which is a very good curriculum. There are smaller things you can do. I mean, just teaching mindful breathing and just having kids do mindful breathing before they have to take a test can help them manage test anxiety. And it doesn't take a whole lot of instruction, but deep breathing, which is what mindful breathing is incompatible with anxiety. Anxiety is short, shallow breaths. Deep breathing just gets away from the short, shallow breaths that accompany anxiety. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I will make this PowerPoint available to people. So I'm now scanning through the questions because I do want to try to stay on top of some of the questions. Okay. And the question about how do we improve working memory? So here's my thinking about this, because I really do think for kids with significant working memory weaknesses, and for many kids with dyslexia, this is the case, no matter what we do to strengthen that skill, we're not going to get it up to average. So I know there are strategies out there designed to strengthen working memory. In fact, there's a multi-million-dollar computer gaming industry that says if you play video games that force you to use working memory, your working memory will improve. Cogmed is probably the best known of those, but there are others as well. But those games have been around long enough, so they've been subjected to a fair amount of research. And when anybody scrutinizes the research in its totality, either by doing a meta-analysis or by, I've seen a couple of blue ribbon panels of scientists convene to scrutinize that research and draw some conclusions. Here's what the general consensus is about computer gaming as a way to enhance working memory. If you play those games, your working memory may improve, but primarily in the context of playing the games. You get better at playing the games. It doesn't necessarily generalize to other situations. And so to me, the way to work with kids with weak working memory is not necessarily to spend a lot of time trying to do working memory exercises to strengthen their working memory, but to work with them to identify strategies that they can use to support their weak working memory, which means mnemonic devices, which means verbal rehearsal, which means checklists, which means putting stuff in writing. I mean, all of those things. And ideally, what I want kids to be able to do eventually is to be able to say, you know what, my working memory doesn't work so well. And it affects me in these three situations. And I'm going to have to come up with a different strategy for each of those three situations. What have I just described? I just described metacognition, right? That's using your thoughts to recognize you have a problem and come up with strategies to solve that problem. And metacognition is a late developing skill. So I think we can talk with kids about what cues, prompts, or reminders would help you. What do you think the best way for you to remember is? But it's a late developing skill. Okay, let me just see if there's anything else in here that I want. Significant differences between males and females in frontal lobe development. Yeah, and I actually wrote to Paul Thompson. I said, are those male brains or female brains that you've got there? I had already pestered him with previous questions, so he stopped answering my emails. But there are a number of studies that show that in general, on average, girls tend to develop these skills before boys do. When you look at adults, so for instance, the brief, the behavior rating inventory of executive functions, interestingly enough, when you use the child version of the brief, they have norms for boys and norms for girls. So they recognize that development is different. When you look at the adult version of the brief, they don't have gender-based norms anymore. So males and females start looking much more like each other in adulthood than they do in childhood. Yeah, so if in terms of delayed gratification, if you go to YouTube and type in Sesame Street executive functions, you will get to those videos. Okay. So let me see. Yep. And someone got Amy got the researcher just right. Is there a tool we can use in class to identify which skills a person is deficient and proficient in, giving us a good starting point? Yeah, I mean, you could give the brief to everyone. That's expensive and time consuming. What I would suggest you do, our book, Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents, has a quicker executive skills questionnaire that you could fill out on all your students. And then you could look at which students are strong in which skills. And you could even target particular kids with particular skill weaknesses, which is probably, the best way to go to that. I've noticed that with 5th and 6th graders, they become emotional roller coasters almost as they reverted back to you. Is it due to hormones? Well, certainly the brain changes at adolescence. And although I tend not to think of grades 5 and 6 as puberty, it is. Puberty is starting younger and younger. So yes, it's either hormones or it's other natural changes that are going on with in adolescence, one of which is dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. The way the brain handles dopamine in adolescence changes. And so by adolescence, kids are looking for dopamine hits. Dopamine is what makes the frontal lobes function smoothly, but it's also the neurotransmitter that controls the reward center of the brain. So kids are looking for quick rewards at adolescence, and that need for increased levels of dopamine leads them to some risk-taking behaviors, which goes along with the response inhibition. Okay. I don't know what conscious discipline is. But there's a recommendation of people. The person who wrote that is saying, you know what, you've got so many questions. I'm going to keep going because I want to make sure I now get through my PowerPoint and don't get sidetracked. I mean, the question about puberty, great question. To me, that's a sidetrack because I want to make sure I get through my questions, my material on flexibility. So let me keep going and we'll take another pause in a bit to answer more questions. All right, so let's go on to flexibility now. So I mentioned that I got interested in executive skills by working with kids with ADHD, and kids with ADHD have all kinds of executive skill challenges. Flexibility is not necessarily a challenge for them. In many cases, it's a strength because they're go with the flow kinds of kids. But I'm sure those of you who work in schools can think of kids who struggle with flexibility. And when I ask that question of a live audience, what population of kids struggle with flexibility, the first answer that comes up is autism spectrum disorder, which makes sense. And that rigid thinking is sort of a critical feature of autism spectrum disorder. But I think about flexibility as an executive skill that sometimes lies beneath the radar. So we see a behavior, we don't realize that it starts with inflexibility. So let's say you have trouble dealing with unexpected changes in plans. What happens when that occurs? Your anxiety level rises. So we see the anxiety, but it started with inflexibility. And then I think about kids with oppositional defiant disorder. I mean, when I'm thinking about those kids, I'm thinking about power struggles and control issues, and they're refusing to do what we've asked. But if you step back and say, what was the trigger? What led that kid to refuse to do what we've asked? Very often is because someone was asking that child to be more flexible than they were capable of being. And all they had was their behavior as a way of saying, I can't do that. So try to decode the behavior when you see that and just ask yourself, could this be starting from a point of inflexibility? Flexibility can be taught. And there are some nice curricula out there designed to do that. Probably the best known is Michelle Garcia Winner's social thinking curriculum. She's created a Superflex character that I think many kids respond to. There's another curriculum that I particularly like called Unstuck and On Target. So you could go to Amazon and just type in Unstuck and On Target, or actually Google it. They have a website. And in fact, it started out as a school-based curriculum, particularly designed for kids on the autism spectrum. But there are a lot of inflexible kids out there who aren't on the autism spectrum who would benefit from some of the lessons in that curriculum. The people who, and so they actually took autism spectrum disorder out of the title when they created a second edition. But if you go to their website, you'll see they have resources for parents as well. They have little video clips that talk about, here's a typical problem situation that parents of inflexible kids encounter. Here's a strategy for handling that. So take a look at their materials. All right, let me go on to sustained attention. Thanks for the feedback about my response inhibition. We'll see how that goes going forward. Because task initiation is a strength for me, which I just want to jump in and answer everybody's question right now, and then I lose track of where I am. Okay, sustained attention. So this one is a critical feature of an attention disorder. There's a key phrase in my definition, though. The definition is the capacity to maintain attention to a situation or task, and the key phrase is in spite of distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. And I've valued that phrase over the years because I don't know how many kids I've seen. Their parents have been nudged into my office by a parent or by a pediatrician because someone thinks their kid has attention problems. And they will say to me, my kid can't have ADD. He can play video games for hours. Well, video games don't involve distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. So what I tell parents is, it's not that kids with ADD can't pay attention, it's they have trouble making themselves pay attention. And it's that making yourself do that defines, kids with ADHD. They have trouble doing that. That's not going to show up with video games. Where are parents going to see it? Homework, chores, boring daily routines. There are a number of different strategies to support kids with weak attention span. But the first one I always give people is you got to start with where the kid is at. If the kid has an attention span of 10 minutes and you give him a 30-minute task to do, it's not going to go well. Because he'll focus for 10 minutes and then he'll get distracted and you'll crawl him back in and maybe he'll focus for another 10 minutes. I think a lot about, I've talked with people who tutor kids with dyslexia, and very often kids who may be able to sustain attention fine in other settings because reading is so hard for them. So it's harder for them to sustain attention during that. So the reading tutors that I've seen who handle this particularly well are ones who come up with a plan for here's how we're going to spend the hour that we're together today, maybe even a checklist. They may even say, here's how much time we're going to spend on each activity. They break it down into no more than 10-minute activities. And if necessary, they build in short breaks in between activities where the child gets to do something fun. And with kids with ADHD, I would recommend movement. Whenever possible, build in quick movement breaks and then get them back to work, because movement is what helps everybody, but particularly kids with attention, maintain arousal, alertness, and focus. So that's the main one I want to mention there. Task initiation is the next executive skill, which is the opposite of procrastination. And this, I think this is the last and hardest skill to acquire or for it to reach full maturation. And I've thought this for years based on my own personal experience and based on my clinical experience. There are a lot of adults out there who struggle with task initiation. If you type procrastination into an academic search engine, you will be hit with over 5,000 citations. So obviously researchers recognize that task initiation is a problem for a lot of people, and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. I've read a few of those articles, and one of them gave me a developmental timeline for procrastination, which I will share with you. So remember, procrastination is the opposite of task initiation, so it's a bad thing. And here's what this article said. It said procrastination increases until the mid to late 20s and decreases gradually after that. Surveys of college students have shown that 86% of college students say that procrastination is a problem for them, and almost 50% of those say that it affects their grades. So when I read that article, I thought, man, we have got to figure out how to teach task initiation. If we could figure that out, we could increase college graduation rates. We could decrease the amount of time kids are spending in college and save parents thousands of dollars. So I began to think about how do you teach task initiation? And I finally came up with a way to do it. It won't work in all cases, but it's a great starting point. I've had a lot of people give me feedback that they find this very helpful. You teach task initiation by asking kids to make a plan with a start time. And then you make sure they start the plan at the time they said they were going to start it. So this is easy for parents to do. They could say to their kid on Saturday morning, what's your plan for cleaning up the bedroom? And the kid says, I'll do it right after lunch. Well, then your job as a parent is to be there right after lunch and make sure your kid starts cleaning up his bedroom at the time he said he was going to do it. And here's why this is important. It goes back to the brain again. The brain learns by association. So it learns by making connections between things. So if you can strengthen the connection between the stated start time and the follow through or the actual start time, if you can glue those two together, then eventually event A will trigger event B. It's a variation on Pavlov's dog, right? Remember that psych experiment where the Russian psychologist rang a bell and presented meat to the dog and the dog salivated? And after a while, all he had to do was ring the bell and the dog salivated because he anticipated that the meat was coming. So that's my recommendation for that. Even it's harder for teachers. And I know one of the things that frustrates teachers is kids not doing their homework. So they never get around to starting their homework. You can ask kids to make homework plans. You can say, tell me what you have to do for homework and when you're going to start each thing, each item. And you can even make that part of the homework assignment. I have a study plan I created where I have the kid identify what tasks they have to do for homework. I have them estimate how long each task will take. That's with time management. We'll get to that in a minute. And then I'll ask them to list when they're going to start. And then the form also has the stated start time and the actual start time on it. If the kids track that and that's part of the homework assignment, that's a check on two different things. Were they right about their time estimation, and did they start when they said they were going to start? So I think it's possible for teachers to work that in. All right, so those are the first 6 foundational skills. Again, those of you who are attending here, if you work at the elementary level, these are the skills to focus on. Those of you working with middle and high school kids who have significant executive skill challenges, these are the executive skills to start with. They are the building blocks for the later skills, but on top of that, they lend themselves to easier interventions. You know, it's a whole lot easier to help a kid make a plan with a start time than it is to help them make a plan. Planning is way more complicated because first of all, what are you trying to plan? What are the resources and materials you need to carry out your plan? What are the steps you need to go through to carry out your plan? What's the logical sequence to those steps? What's important, what's not important on that plan? So all of that goes into planning. So you can see this is the late developing skill. When I think about planning in a school context, I immediately think about long-term projects. And I decided quite a few years ago now that there's a mismatch between when teachers expect kids to do long-term projects, when they assign long-term projects, and the age at which kids can independently plan those projects successfully. And I think teachers understand that. So they do the planning for kids. So they break it down into subtasks and timelines and interim deadlines, and they walk kids through the project, which is totally developmentally appropriate. What it's doing though is it's failing to take advantage of the opportunity to teach planning. So when I'm talking with teachers, I'm always saying, rather than doing the planning for kids, do the planning with kids. So you model the planning process and then you ask them to follow the model. We have a long-term, well, you have Smart But Scattered. There's a long-term project planning form in Smart But Scattered that would allow you to do that. So if you and the kid are together filling out that form, eventually they'll be able to use that form independently and they'll be able to plan projects on their own. Okay, organization. There's a key word in my definition here, the ability to create and maintain systems to keep track of information or materials. You know, when I ask a live audience, what's the key word? Nowadays they're getting it, but a few years ago when I was asking this, they would give me words like ability, create, systems. Well, you know what? This is my weakest skill. And what you're seeing behind me is the neat part of my study. You're not seeing the messy part. Because I will tell you that I am great at creating systems of organization. Every 4 weeks, I have to come up with another system for keeping my study clean because the last one didn't work. It's the maintenance part that's hard for disorganized people. And if you've ever tried to turn a disorganized kid into an organized kid, you know this is a long-term labor-intensive process. Because it's not just a question of creating a system and handing it off to the kid and expecting them to run with it. It's not even a question, because everybody's organizational system is somewhat unique, of saying to a kid, of designing the system with the kid, of saying to the kid, you know what, your backpack's a mess. You can't find your homework when you need to do it, and you can't find it when you need to hand it in. So let's take your backpack apart and figure out a system that will work for you. We'll put our heads together. You still can't hand it off to the kid and expect them to run with it. I finally figured out why that is. And it's because at any single point in time, it is faster not to use an organizational system than to use an organizational system. right? It's way faster to take that science worksheet and stuff it in the backpack wherever. That is to take out the science notebook, open that up, take out the incomplete homework folder, open that up, put it all neatly back in and put it back in the backpack. Yeah, it may take longer in the long run because you can't find it, it's messy, you have to get another copy, whatever. But in the immediate moment, it's faster not to use an organizational system. One of the biggest challenges I found, because parents and kids tend to have different executive skills profiles, in part because the kids' skills are still developing. But with organization, I have found this is a somewhat unique skill in that I've found that this is one where people who are highly organized, whenever I ask them, how far back do you remember being that way? They tell me forever. If you ask me in terms of my disorganization, if you ask me how far back I remember being disorganized, I will tell you forever. So it feels like there's a good chunk of people who describe themselves as highly organized. In fact, I would say the majority of them who it's built into them. It's just natural. One of the worst combinations I've seen in terms of parent and kid profiles being different is a highly organized parent with a slob of a kid, because that disorganized kid just grates on the parent. So when I'm making recommendations to parents around organization, my recommendation is start small. Start, I mean, he may need a lot of support cleaning that bedroom, but you can ask him to clean off his desk before he goes to bed each night. In school, I recommend whenever possible that schools develop school-wide organizational systems, explicitly teach the kids those systems, and keep that in place long enough for kids to learn the system. It's a great process at the middle school level because kids really do need organizational systems by then. They don't necessarily, by the time kids hit high school, I haven't found high school teachers that are willing to teach kids organizational systems except for resource room teachers. But by then, at least they have 2 years of an organizational system behind them, and maybe they can tinker with the system that they've been taught and make it work for them. Okay. Let me just pause here because I got 3 more, and I'll just go through and see if there's some other questions I can answer quickly. Let's see, resources. The resource, yeah, Amy's great. She's already answering it. Unstuck and on Target is that one. The same people who created the Unstuck and on Target program wrote a book called Solving Executive Function Challenges. And what I like about that is, first of all, it's a really thin book. It's readable. And it's for both parents and teachers. It's full of scripts. Here's how to talk to your kid to model flexibility, or to talk to your kid to help them get unstuck when they're being inflexible. Okay, so I think I must have discouraged people from asking questions.
No, I have, Dr. Dawson, I have a couple that have been sent to me, if I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, throw them out.
How to build up students' reading stamina suggestions.
Yeah, so that's a couple of ways, bit by bit. Starting by asking them, how long do you think you can go before you need a break? And then honoring that for a while until you feel like, okay, we're pretty solid at 5 minutes before they need a break. Can you go 6 minutes? So building that up incrementally. The other way to do it is to build in some powerful incentives. So they can earn points for every minute that they work, and you can create a reward menu that they can trade those points in for something that's attractive to them. And I know, reinforcers lose their appeal after a while, which is why I always recommend using points, because then you can create a different reward menu each time. But I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind when we're talking about reading stamina. And that is that this is for kids with dyslexia. And I'm going to play a recording before we're done today of someone interviewing a kid with dyslexia. And you already know this, but it just hits home how hard reading is for these kids. And if the more we can keep that in mind, the more we realize that we need to do whatever we can to make the task more bearable to them, by building in frequent breaks, by building in reinforcers, by giving them choices. So I talked earlier about creating a tutoring schedule for a kid. You might create, so here are the 6 things we want to do this hour. What do you want to do first? What do you want to do second? So the more you can build choice in, alternating between preferred and non-preferred activities. So even if all they're doing is working, some work is easier than others. So layer those in, hard reading task, easy reading task, hard reading task, easy reading task. I mean, all of those are the suggestions I would offer for that. Was there another one?
There is. Do you have a format that you would suggest to use with students for a study plan, study guides?
Yeah, and you know what? Why don't I, well, what do you mean by, because I described that study plan that I'm happy to make a copy of, and I can send that to you, Amy, but
Okay.
it sounds like were they asking for something else?
I don't think so. They said they're
Okay.
just doing a format. So
Yeah. So, and then the other thing, in terms of studying for tests, Smart but Scattered has a process for helping kids study for tests. So that's something to look at as well. And again, I think this is particularly relevant for kids who struggle with reading or who struggle with hard tasks, because the plan, and we've revised it, so some of our later versions are probably a little more are a little better than the one that's in Smart but Scattered. But saying, here are 16 different ways of studying for a test. Pick 3 and do each one for 10 minutes. So you can break down studying for a test into small segments as well, build in breaks, rewards, whatever in between those. Okay, is that it?
And the last one was you were talking about the importance of a school-wide organizational system. So do you have an example or a suggestion of something that a school might use?
Okay, so I'm going to start making a list. Yeah, I will get you a copy. Actually, rather than making a list, here's what I'm going to do. I have this entire folder full of supplementary materials, and I realize that it may be overwhelming to people, but it's packed full of useful materials. So that study plan I just described, I have like 4 or 5 different study plans in there. And I have a folder for each executive skill, and in the folder labeled organization, I have a school-wide organizational system developed by a middle school in Salina, Kansas. And if you look through the PowerPoints, I think you'll get the system. I think you can understand it from that. I've actually used that as a consultant. I've used it with schools to help them design their own organizational systems. So what you get is this long Dropbox link, and in parentheses at the end, ES supplementary materials. When you get that, you should be able to open it. Lately, I've had a few people saying they can't open the link, and it turned out they can't open the link because they're trying to open it in their school email, and schools have put tremendous restrictions now on any kind of attachments or anything. So forward that link to your home email, and then you should be able to open it. But okay, so let me just make this. So I'm going to send the PowerPoint to Amy, and I'm going to send the Dropbox link to Amy after this is over.
Thank you. We're getting lots of positive feedback.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It's stuff and hold on to that link because I keep adding stuff. I just added more stuff this week. So I try to organize it, but there's tons of stuff in there. Okay, so let me go on to make sure I get through this. And I really do want to, oh, yeah, I can't send you the link now. I'll get it to you just because it would be interrupting my my presentation, and that gets me confused, but we'll get it to you. And I assume Amy's going to send it out to everybody on the email list. Am I right, Amy?
Yes, I'll do that.
Yeah, okay, good. So time management is the next executive skill. And remember, we're now into the advanced skills. We don't expect young kids to be able to manage their time well. We do the time management for them. Because if you think about time management, it's got a bunch of earlier executive skills embedded in it. So time management is basically task initiation, sustained attention, and planning. With one additional element that's unique to time management, and that is time estimation, the ability to estimate how long it takes to do something. And in my experience working with kids, more often than not, they underestimate how long an effortful task is going to take. And then they leave it to the last minute, like if it's a project, and then they run out of time, or they pull an all-nighter if they're in high school or college. I do though see kids who overestimate how long a task is going to take, and then they don't want to start it because in their mind it's going to take forever. I remember years ago working with a third grader whose mom told me every night they fought about math homework, long knockdown, drag out fights about math homework. The kid could do math. That wasn't the issue. He hated to do the homework. And it finally occurred to the mother, they were spending way more time fighting about the homework than would actually take him to do it. So she said to her kid at one point, how long do you think this math worksheet is going to take? And the kid said, it's going to take at least an hour, which is a long time in the life of an 8-year-old. But the mom said, are you sure? Let's see if that's the case. They wrote down the time he started the homework, the time he finished. They did the subtraction was 10 minutes. The kid was stunned. He had no idea he could get the homework done that quickly. And time estimation is a skill that can be taught. So the next night, the mom could have said to that kid, remember last night you thought the math was going to take an hour and only took 10 minutes? Look at this worksheet. How long do you think this one's going to take? Let's take a guess and see if you're right. And with practice, kids will learn to calibrate time more accurately. Okay, and then the next one is goal-directed persistence. So when we think about this goal, this executive skill, the way we think about it, this is a late developing skill because we're not talking about short-term goals. We're talking about, setting bigger goals. And this is Russ Barkley's definition. It's the capacity to have a goal and to follow through to complete it. So you'll see other executive skills embedded in this one because you can't just set a goal and forget about it. You got to remember it. So there's working memory. You have to have a plan for achieving the goal. There's planning. You have to start and finish the plan. So there's task initiation and sustained attention. You have to resist the temptation to engage in all those other all those other things you'd rather be doing than working on your goals. So there's response inhibition. And if that's irritating or annoying to you, then you also have to manage your emotions. So there's emotional control. This is the killer skill for middle school parents. Because they expect kids to have this skill by middle school. And in my experience, most kids at that age don't. And I know that's what they're thinking when they come into my office and they say, doesn't my kid realize that how he's doing in 8th grade is going to affect what college he gets into in 4 years? And the short answer to that is no. These kids don't have that kind of time horizon. They have not lived long enough to be able to picture 4 years out. And they don't have this concrete sense of what college is, so they can't picture the goal either. And we're asking them to picture and work for a goal that's amorphous to them, that's undefined to them, and that's 4 years away. So I'm always preaching patience to parents of middle school kids. And my recommendation is if you want to encourage goal-directed persistence in kids of that age, and I think you can do that, start with something the kid wants. Rather than something you want, because then you'll have that impetus, that energy behind the kid that he wants to work on that goal. It could be a sports goal. In high school, a couple of things that many teenagers want, which require goal-directed persistence, is they want the driver's license, they want a job. But one of my favorite ways of encouraging goal-directed persistence, because you can start this at a younger age, is have kids save up money for something that costs more than their weekly allowance. Because then you can talk with them about, how are you going to earn money? How are you going to save money? How are you going to resist the temptation to spend smaller amounts of money on something before you've saved up for that big thing that you want to save up for? So all of that gets built into goal-directed persistence. And then finally, metacognition, which is, this is, again, I gave you one definition earlier. It's the ability to see the big picture. It's the it's the ability to put the pieces of the puzzle together, connect the dots. It's hard to talk about metacognition without using a metaphor, which is apt because meta is the same in both. But if I were going to use more psychological terms, I'd talk about self-awareness. And self-awareness includes self-monitoring and self-evaluation, observing how you're working in the moment, or evaluating how you did afterwards and making some decisions about what you'll do differently the next time. or what you'll keep the same the next time. I think it was this little voice in your head that is saying, okay, am I staying focused on my homework? Am I working fast enough so I'll finish it by bedtime? Have I checked the rubric for that project to make sure everything's in there? And you get a grade back on a test or a project and you say, that wasn't the grade I wanted. What can I do differently the next time so that I can improve? Maybe I should talk to the teacher to see if she has some ideas. All of that is metacognition. It's also, this is the executive skill that underlies any kind of abstract thinking. It's a very late developing skill. And just to give you one example, I saw a study a few years ago of kids' ability to write a good summary. So summarizing requires metacognition because you have to take a lengthy passage and condense it down into 2 or 3 sentences that capture the gist of the passage. And so that capturing the gist, that's what metacognition is. That's that ability to see the big picture. What this study found was only 14% of 5th graders can write a good summary. Only 28% of 7th graders can write a good summary. Only 36% of 10th graders, only 50% of college students. Now you can teach kids to write a good summary. Although I've had many 5th and 6th grade teachers tell me the younger they are, when you try to teach how to write a summary, the harder it is for them. But what I think the slowly increasing percentages indicate is this is how slowly metacognition develops in the absence of direct instruction. And summarizing is just one abstract task we ask kids to do. Asking kids to read between the lines with reading comprehension, that requires metacognition. Asking kids to make plans for what they're reading and to read for certain information. I mean, all of that relies on the kids' metacognitive skills. Or just one other example, I've been working with a couple of high school teachers at a high school here in New Hampshire, and they both have kids in junior high. And one of them was telling about her, I think it was her 7th grade son, whose homework assignment was to annotate an article. All he knew about annotating was it's highlighting stuff and it's writing stuff in the margin. So she sent me a copy of what he'd done because he highlighted almost every sentence in each paragraph. And what he wrote in the margin didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it became more nonsensical as the article went along. She sent me 3 pages. By page 2, all he's writing in the margin is no. And eventually he's writing no with a much heavier pencil pressure, and he's underlining no and he's highlighting no. I mean, this kid was totally frustrated because he didn't know how to annotate. That requires metacognition. And if you're working with kids who don't know how to do those kinds of things and you're thinking, how do I teach them? Obviously, the more concrete you can be, the better. But I'll tell you what I did after I saw that annotation example. I went to Google and I said, how do you teach annotation? And there's some great resources out there. There's probably great resources on how to teach kids to write summaries. So look good, because people have broken those down into steps that makes it much easier to teach. Okay, I think that's it for that. And now I want to connect this all to reading. So I'm going to take each of these skills, and the way I'm going to connect it to reading acquisition is I've divided. I'm going to show you a grid that divides it into 2 groups. The skills you need for acquiring reading skills, like learning how to decode, learning how to read sight words or whatever. So reading acquisition, and the skills you need for reading comprehension, because they're a little different, or they manifest themselves differently with each of those. And so let me walk you through this, and then I'm going to play, as I say, this interview of a kid with dyslexia trying to read. Okay, so I'll just go through them one at a time. Response inhibition. So, and I'm going to talk about what good readers do. I think in the back of your mind, you may be thinking about, so poor readers, what does this look like in poor readers? When I get to goal-directed persistence, I'll make that explicit, but as you may want to be thinking about kids who are struggling with reading. So good readers at the reading acquisition stage, they can sit still, they can resist distractions, they don't jump to conclusions when they encounter an unfamiliar word. When they're reading for comprehension, they're able to choose the correct meaning of a word when they see a word in text. They're able to follow the plot by focusing on relevant information. Very often when you talk to it with, I've tested, young adults who with attention disorders. And what they've told me is they can't read a book because they can't stay focused on the plot. So whether that's response inhibition or sustained attention, it's probably a combination of the two, but they read something and then that makes them think about something else. And so they go off in that direction, and then they go off in another direction, and they realize their eyes have been scanning the page, but they haven't been paying attention to what they're reading. So with working memory, huge working memory demands for both for reading acquisition and for reading comprehension. Just a few in terms of reading acquisition. When sounding out words, good readers can recall the correct sequence of sounds. They can hold new words in mind when they see them again in the text later on that same page. They require fewer repetitions to commit sight words to memory. They can learn and apply phonics rules. So all of that requires working memory. For reading comprehension, I'm pulled a quote from Kelly Cartwright, who wrote a great book. The reference for it is at the end of this PowerPoint on reading comprehension and executive skills. And this really sort of captures it for me. At the very least, good comprehenders must decode print, choose between multiple meanings for words, employ comprehension strategies, and access prior knowledge, all while building and holding a mental model of text meaning. So remember my definition of working memory, the ability to hold in mind information while you're performing a complex task. There it is, right there. So even once kids have learned how to read, if they have trouble with working memory, they're going to have trouble understanding what they read. Emotional control. So at the reading acquisition phase, good readers are able to manage their emotions in order to attend to the lesson rather than worrying about something. They understand and retain the critical information being taught. For reading comprehension, same thing. Good readers are able to manage their emotions in order to attend to text and understand it and retain the critical information. So same skill required at both levels for reading acquisition and reading comprehension. With flexibility, there you see it looks a little different with reading acquisition compared to reading comprehension, but it's at base probably the aspects of the same skill, which is flexibility. When decoding words, good readers are able to shift strategies when the first attempt fails. They understand that the same letters have different sounds and they can make adjustments as needed. With reading comprehension, good readers use flexibility by being able to shift interpretations based on new information in the text, and then also to be able to select the correct meaning for multiple meanings of words based on the text. So they're able to make adjustments in their understanding of their reading based on new information as they encounter it in their reading, or they hit a word and they think it's one word, and then they realize, oh, that word has a different meaning, and that's the meaning we want to plug in here. Okay. Sustained attention. Good readers can persist with reading tasks even when they're challenging or not fun. In terms of reading comprehension, they can sustain attention to the reading material in order to follow the narrative of the plot. With task initiation at the reading acquisition phase, they can initiate reading tasks even when they're challenging or not fun. And at the same thing with reading comprehension, they can initiate reading tests even when they're challenging or not fun. Now, keep in mind, with both task initiation and sustained attention, if reading comes naturally to you, then it's less likely to be overly challenging and it's less likely to be not fun, right? Although kids with sustained problems, kids with attention disorders frequently find text not fun, even when they can read it well. So we're putting increased demands on kids with dyslexia, even with these foundational skills, because they have to apply themselves to tasks that are challenging, boring, difficult, tedious. Now let's move on to organization. demands for organization are less apparent in terms of reading acquisition. Although I must say, I shared this table with a guy in Ohio that in a school district where I've done some work, who's very skilled with reading recovery and the whole process of learning how to read around that. And he gave me lots of reasons why organization is really a critical skill for acquisition. I think he's thinking about organization a little differently than I am. So I'm still saying it's less in demand with reading acquisition. So what have we done? We've now come to the foundational executive skills, and you can see that they are most essential during reading acquisition. The advanced skills become much more in demand and much more prominent as we moved into reading comprehension. So organization is required to understand both sentence structure and narrative structure, as shown by organized retelling of stories. We use organizational cues in text aid comprehension, such as headings, bolded words, diagrams, things like that. We're drawing on all kinds of information in the way the text is organized in order to understand what we're reading. Planning and prioritizing, less critical at the reading acquisition phase. With reading comprehension, however, it factors in much more prominently. Good readers are able to preview texts, to understand the sequence of information, to access prior knowledge, and to understand the level of effort required to comprehend the text, so they can make plans for how they're going to tackle that text. With time management, again, at the reading acquisition phase, it's less important, in part because when kids are learning how to read, we're managing their time for them. As in terms of reading comprehension, however, especially once kids have acquired reading, and now we're asking them to read to learn rather than learn to read, then it becomes more important, because then good readers can estimate how much time to allocate to a reading or writing task and to plan accordingly. So with goal-directed persistence, this is what strikes me about this is, with kids who struggle with reading, this skill may be critical. Kids who learn to read quickly and easily, goal-directed persistence is less important. But if it's hard for them, they really have to make themselves stick with stuff long enough to get it done. And so goal-directed persistence, we put much more, or kids have to lean on that much more if they're struggling with reading acquisition. Obviously, for reading comprehension, good readers are able to set a goal for reading and make a plan to achieve that goal. And then finally, metacognition. And again, metacognition is present with different levels of sophistication at both the reading acquisition stage and the reading comprehension stage. So a reading acquisition, being able to identify letter patterns and language structures that make word identification easier. If you have that degree of metacognition in the early stages of reading, reading will be easier for you. But it's incredibly important with reading comprehension, because you have to be able to connect text to prior knowledge. Good readers gauge their understanding of the text, ask relevant questions, make predictions, can identify characters, motives, feelings, internal states to explain their actions, can make abstract inferences to understand text at a deeper level. So those are all, those are how I break down the executive skills required for reading acquisition and the executive skills required for reading comprehension. Now, before we go on to open it up for questions, I want to do one more thing, and that is, I'm going to play, it's about a 6-minute segment. We've got time. A 6-minute segment. It's the opening segment of one of the episodes on This American Life, which is a great podcast. Especially recently, he's been doing a lot of podcasts on how kids think and how kids see the world. This one, the rest of the episode is not about that, but he spends 6 minutes talking to a kid as he's trying to read a word, and it's a child with dyslexia. So I'm going to stop this share and get the actual episode, and let me see, because I've already got it teed up to the place where I want it. So there's nothing really to see here. You just have to listen, and then we'll go back to my PowerPoint again. So, okay. Here we go.
Cassidy's 10, 5th grade. At the end of the school year, he's one of the talented extroverts, singing in front of everybody, parents and kids, with his band. Okay, but here's something that's hard for him. Reading. It'd be okay for stretches, you know, when he already knows the words.
One day the sun shone, so it was not cold, so cold.
But he has dyslexia. So reading an unfamiliar word, he has to decode it.
If it's a big word that I've never seen before, like that word, I don't know what that says.
Okay, let's walk through that one.
Wait, wait,
Here, talk me through what you're doing. So you're getting the duh.
I had to.
There is no video.
Um,
It's just
if
an
you
audio.
didn't, like in the recording, you might hear me say bed.
Thinking of the word bed
I did
is a
that
way to
just
keep
to make
B's
sure
and
that
D's
I'm
straight.
saying it right.
This is actually one of the toughest things for Cassidy to learn. B's and D's, when they're not capitalized.
B's and D's, they look the exact same, but just flipped. If you take a B, it can also be a D. And it was just super annoying for a long while.
So it's easy to get him confused.
Yeah.
So there's this trick that lots of people with dyslexia are taught.
Spell
They
bed.
picture the word bed, which, if you think about it, kind of looks like a bed. Like the posts of the B and the D are like the footboard and the headboard of the bed, and then the E is kind of the mattress.
I picture the letters and I go B for B, and then D, and then boom.
There are so many little rules and tricks like this that some kids with dyslexia use. They have all kinds of names. The fizzle rule, the floss rule, short vowel protectors, welded sounds. These are the rules of the English language that most of us somehow absorb, but we are not aware of. The mechanics of when to use a long vowel or a short vowel, when G or GH are silent. There were dozens of these, and then wield them like tools, one after another, to decode how a word should sound.
And then E, R,
Anyway, back to decoding this word,
D, S,
which, by the way, the word he's trying to read is devastating.
Divas.
What is VAST? How would that sound?
Wait, oh, vast. Divas.
Mm-hmm. Then AT.
And then at, in. Divasting. I think I'm doing something wrong.
He tries breaking the word down syllable by syllable, like his teacher taught him. Explains one part of the word as a CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant.
Ink.
He looks for parts of the word that he recognizes.
I know ink from class and devasting.
You're leaving out the middle one, though.
Devastating. Devast. I really don't know.
You're very close. You want me to give you a hint?
Sure.
Okay, this one is a long, long A, so it's ating.
Devastating. Devastating.
Do you know that word, devastating?
Devastating. I do know that word.
That is so much work.
It is. It really is.
Later, I asked his teacher what rule might have gotten in there, and she said, magic E. If you had recognized that the ing in devastating might have been replacing an E on the end of the word, that final E would have told him how to pronounce the tate in devastate. So many rules to remember. And irritatingly, so many exceptions to the rules you have to memorize.
For example, salmon. It would be pronounced salmon, but it's salmon. Like, why? There's so many words that are like, deal with it.
And so Cassidy's in the situation where things that seem to come so easily to other kids, he has to work so much harder.
Okay, so we'll stop there. So think about, let me go back to, just to, you can see the list of executive skills, because I want you to think about what are the executive skill challenges that Cassidy is dealing with? What executive skill weaknesses jump out at you? Just put some notes in chat so you can see what people are saying here. Working memory, sustained attention, that's good. I think working memory is the one that jumps out. I mean, again, this just sort of reinforces what I said earlier, that for kids with dyslexia, working memory is problematic. What I like is that a number of you have picked up flexibility as another executive skill challenge. Now, interestingly enough, this kid may be flexible in other situations because there are different kinds of flexibility, but it is clear to me that with reading, he's not able flexibly to shift between different strategies. He can't say, oh, that's not the way to attack this word. Let me think of another one. And it was interesting because what I found frustrating about this is they never got to where you put the accent because that was going to be the key to this kid maybe being able to decode the word. So let's think now about, I want to move to what executive skills strengths does this kid have? What do you think is keeping him going? I mean, what do you see as strengths for him? Yeah, okay. I love it. All right, so most of you are identifying emotional control as a strength for him. Yes, and goal-directed persistence and actually sustained attention. I think that's true. The fact that he persisted with that word for the longest time, and so that's both sustained attention and goal-directed persistence there. But the emotional control piece, what I love about this is, once again, it illustrates that point I made earlier, that kids with dyslexia almost have to have better emotional control than typical kids do. And I will tell you, I've tested a lot of kids with dyslexia over my career. And the ones that stick out in my mind, they fall into two camps. The kids who are amazing at emotional control, when those kids hit high school, I remember the first year after I finished my doctorate, I was working in a middle high school in Maine. And I tested like a 16-year-old had severe dyslexia, who, what struck me about him was he still felt okay about himself. He exuded a kind of confidence that was like, okay, I know there's this piece of me that doesn't work right, but you know what, the rest of me works. And he was an athlete, so it may well have been that sports was where he saw his identity, and that's what helped him retain that strong sense of self. And then a few years ago, I saw this kid who, I'd seen him twice. I saw him when he was in 4th grade. He had dyslexia, he had attention problems. Those are the two issues he was dealing with. And then his mom called me after his freshman year in high school. He'd gone to a big regional high school. He was really struggling. She was not happy with the way the school was handling his reading problems, in part because he's now a behavior problem. And the school, that's all the school is looking at, his behavior problems. And she kept feeling like they're not addressing his dyslexia. So she brought him in to see me to provide documentation to try to get more support for him around his reading disability. And we started with an IQ test. He did just fine. He was comfortable with what I asked him to do. He didn't, and these tests are designed to get harder. He was fine as they got harder. He was willing to take risks. Everything was looking good. And then when we finished the IQ test, I said, okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do some reading. And suddenly the anxiety level rose. He said, can we take a break? Do we really have to do any reading? Can I go talk with my mom? And I thought, oh my God, he's stressed out by reading. So I said, yeah, sure. Go talk with your mom. She was in the waiting room. And while he was doing that, I just started looking through all the materials I had from the school and saw that they had recently done some reading testing with him. His scores were not good. I didn't need to redo any reading testing with him. I could just reference those scores in making a case for him having dyslexia. So I went back out to the waiting room. Their mom and the kid were the only ones there, so we could talk in the waiting room. And I said, you don't have to do any reading. I think I got what I need from that. And he looked immensely relieved. And then I said to him, but there are some issues I think you're struggling with. I think you got attention problems. And he said, I do have attention problems. He was very open in acknowledging those problems. But his emotional control was what was getting him in trouble now. He was bolting out of class, especially when he felt like people were putting him on the spot in terms of reading. Towards the end of the year, he not only ran out of class, he ran out of the school. And on his way out of the school, he pushed the school resource officer, and the school resource officer was a policeman. So now he's in trouble with the law. It started with dyslexia, with the addition of an attention disorder on top of that. And his behavior by the time he hit high school obscured everything else. And I just felt, so bad for him about that. So the kids with this, and I almost, because I do see those kids who are managing the emotional side of having dyslexia really well. And I thought, oh, they are giving all these other kids with dyslexia a hard time. I mean, they're making it so much harder because these are the kids that everybody wants to work with. Everybody's comfortable. Look at how hard this kid is working. Look at how much persistence he has. Look at how open he is to continue to struggle with this. And then you say to that kid who's got poor emotional control and dyslexia, you're saying, why can't you be like that? Again, not you guys, but I do think that's what happens. That's our reaction. So I will get out of here, but these are the books I'd recommend. And again, you'll get the whole PowerPoint. Kelly Cartwright's book, Executive Skills and Reading Comprehension. If you want to think about applying executive skills more in a school context, Smart but Scattered was written for home. It has a lot of home-based strategies. Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents has a lot of school-based strategies that you may want to take a look at. And it's more relevant. It's got adaptations for working with teenagers. Those of you who work with elementary age kids, if you're working in classrooms, I highly recommend Lori Faith's book, Executive Function Skills in the Classroom, Overcoming Barriers, Building Strategies. I'm the third author. I didn't have much to do with this book other than cheering Faith and Carol Bush on. They were the primary authors. Lori Faith is a master teacher. She now has a doctorate and she's running a research center at the University of Toronto in Canada, but she just writes, she understands executive skills deeply, and she has great ideas about how to incorporate these into the classroom. Okay, so I am going to get out of my PowerPoint and then just open it up for questions or comments as well. Angie, this is great. Metacognition, and I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. You're absolutely right. Metacognition was used because he did an amazing job of explaining what his thought process was, skills he was trying to use, using that verbal recognition when some kids can do things but not explain how they did it. Yeah, he's remarkable in that respect, which again makes you realize that your ability to manage verbal and process and express yourself verbally doesn't necessarily predict what's going on with kids with dyslexia. And there are different brain processes involved. So Amy, I don't know if there are other questions that have come to you, or if people want to type in questions now.
I don't have any others that have come to me, but if anyone has any others and would like to add those to the chat, we have a few minutes.
Yeah, so Stacey, thanks for the nice feedback about Smart but Scattered. Well, the assessment tool is not, well, I forget what Smart but Scattered is. Smart but Scattered has an executive skills questionnaire for parents to fill out. It's pretty, yeah, actually. So if you look at Smart but Scattered, chapter is it? Chapter 2 has executive skills questionnaires for different age levels. And I think although we wrote it for parents, I think a lot of them you could use in the school setting as well. And so pick the grade level that you're working with. And again, I mean, you could fill out one of these questionnaires for each of the kids in your class and then chart a profile. Look at the 3 strongest skills, look at the 3 weakest skills, look at how they cluster. Think about strategies for supporting those skills or for strengthening those skills in the classroom. So if you have Smart but Scattered, I think you have a great place to start. In the executive skills in children and adolescents, we've also created an executive skills problem checklist, which has more precise descriptors of problem situations or problem behaviors. You could supplement it with that if you wanted to fine tune it or do a more fine grained analysis. But I think the place to start would be with the rating scales in chapter 2. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Do you recommend a beginning of the year type of assessment to use in the classroom?
Oh, you want to get to know your kids. That's a good question. You want to get to know your kids first, because you're going to want to do some behavior observations before. So I would give them at least 6 to 8 weeks of watching them in the classroom before I would fill out one of these rating scales on them, just to watch to see how things sort of shake out as the year progresses. I mean, again, with some kids, you'll know right away. You know, kids with problems with response inhibition, you'll probably see it the first day, or the first day they're comfortable. Some kids with response inhibition can be a little uptight initially, but I think in order to give it some, give yourself some time to get to know them a little better, would be the way to do that. So.
Okay, I think that's the last question that came through. The TLC posted for you that you'll be receiving your PD certificate in an email within 24 to 48 hours. If you were here with us the entire time, it contains the official ADE PD code for this session and 2 hours of credit. There is a link to a form. If you are interested in any of our graduate programs, you can click on that form and check which ones, and we'll be happy to contact you all. You're going to get an evaluation form with your certificate of attendance, so be sure to complete that. We love that feedback. There are more sessions available this summer for free. There's a link to our COE PDs, and we will be sending this out to you once the recording is available. So again, if you're interested in the MSc in Literacy with the dyslexia endorsement, I always am happy to plug that one. We're accredited by the International Dyslexia Association. We can get you certified with CIRI as either a dyslexia interventionist or specialist, and we have a very competitive tuition. So I will put my email in the chat box for anyone that would like to reach out. And other than that, we thank you, Dr. Dawson, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Okay, great. It was nice to be there. And I am, as I speak, compiling the email to Amy to send the PowerPoint and the Dropbox link. So you should get that shortly too.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Nice talking with you.